Dive into the history behind the bar with everybody. The bar itself actually dates right back to 900 AD. We are dated by both the National Museum of Ireland and certified by the Guinness Book of World Records. Over here is our cert from the Guinness World Records, followed by our letter from them, dating us right back to 900 and the oldest pub anywhere. Now what you have in the cabinet over here is part of the old walls on display, made of what's called wattle and wicker, and it's interwoven hazel sticks, held together with horsehair and clay. And what you see in that cabinet is exactly what's inside all of the walls the whole way right around. It is the same original building made from wattle and wicker, built right back in 900 AD. If you may also notice that there is a slope running on the floor. How are you doing, folks? You can go straight down if you wish. No matter. How are you doing? You all well? You can go straight through there, folks. How are you all doing?
Good, great.
You're very welcome.
How are you all?
Now, folks, as I say, there is a slope running the whole way through the bar, right down. One or two more Irish coffees and it'll be perfectly straight. That slope, actually, folks, that slope, prior to COVID, ran the whole way out through the beer garden and out to the River Shannon out the back. The only problem was, when it flooded, it ran back the other way and flooded us. So during COVID, we knocked everything, leveled it all up so we don't flood anymore. But the reason or the purpose behind this slope, that's the original drainage system. The water would flow down the hill, in the front door, down the slope, out the back into the river. And they would put down sawdust. That answers your question on the sawdust. Put down sawdust then on the ground to soak up any excess water. That's the tradition of the sawdust. Now how the bar came about, going right back to 900, a man called Lewin built the bar here. He also set up a crossing point here on the River Shannon. He had a raft system in place, and he guided both people and their animals over and back the treacherous waters here. Now that is the River Shannon out the back, which is fed by Lough Ree. We're 5 minutes from it. A huge lake, 30 kilometres long, 10 wide, and then it funnels into the River Shannon here at Athlone. But you'd have to come the whole way around the lake, and the very first crossing you came to was directly here at the back door, and that is why he located the bar here. And he guided both people and their animals over and back the treacherous waters here. Now here in Ireland, nearly every town or city is built around either a castle or a fort of some sort. Every town apart from Athlone. For some strange reason, they've done everything backwards here in Athlone. The Athlone is actually built not around the castle, but around the pub. They have their priorities right. They did actually build the pub here first. Then a settlement built up around it and across the point, and they didn't bother with a castle at all until 1129, when King Turlough O'Connor built the first wooden castle here to guard the settlement that had built up around the pub and the crossing point. He called that settlement Athlone, meaning the ford of Lewin, or the place of Lewin. And today, in Irish, Athlone is Athlone. So that's even how the town here got its name, from the very first person that built the bar here, right back in 900 AD. Now, as I say, we are dated by both the National Museum of Ireland and certified by the Guinness Book of World Records, right back to 900 and the oldest pub anywhere in the world. And you found it, and you're very, very welcome. That is one piece of history. There's actually another huge piece of history here on Lough Ree here, right beside us. Anybody here have an interest in whiskey?
Yes.
Well, thank God for that, or I was a bottom. Now, this is not a story. This is something we've 14 years research gone into, the whole history and origin of whiskey itself. Now, going back 14 years ago, there was no Google. Can you imagine that? No Google. What would you have done? We don't know. Yeah, it was all hands-on, up and down on a weekly basis to the National Museum. I'll go up chasing that one week and I'll come back with that. Next week I'll go up chasing that, and I'll come back with that and that. It was all hands-on, meeting with local historians, people who'd written books on Lough Ree and its islands, chatting with people who lived on the islands, and going to lectures on the huge Viking history that was here on the lake. But the best part of it, about it not being Googled, everything is fully backed up with us by the National Museum of Ireland. So much so, this history is going into book form right now. And in the very near future, there's actually a Netflix production company coming over from California to do a whole documentary series here with us on the origin of our whiskey here. So keep an eye on that one, see where it goes, see what happens. Now, for me to start talking about whiskey, you're going to be here for about 2 weeks. Minimum. So we'll just touch the tip of the iceberg on the whole lot here. It was actually the monks here from the islands of both Inishpiran and Clonmacnoise. Same order of monks, 2 different monasteries, who were the first people to distill whiskey in the world, where they took distillation. Now, distillation actually began in the Middle East, but not as an alcohol. It began as a perfume. You are now drinking perfume. Yeah, it was brought back from the Middle East. It was brought back to northern Spain by the Moors. There were traders from northern Spain, had trade links with the Middle East, brought back various spices, etc., but also brought back the art of distilling this perfume with them to northern Spain. The monks of Inishkillen happened to be there on their missions at the time, and somehow managed to take this perfume and turn it into an alcoholic beverage. Or in other words, it smelled lovely, one of them drank it. That's what happened. Had a bit of a funny effect on him, probably the best night of his life ever. As a result, these monks actually thought this spirit cured all illnesses, and they brought back the art of distilling this spirit with them to the two main monasteries of Inishkillen and Clonmacnoise. Now the monks of Inishkillen here, they spoke Irish. They called this spirit Ishka Baha, meaning the water of life, because they thought it cured everything. The monks of Clonmacnoise spoke Latin, the international language at the time. They taught in Latin. They called it Aqua Vitae, also meaning the water of life. Now these monks traded massively in this spirit, and as a result of their trade, this spirit spread from Lough Ree right around the world. Now they traded with all the different factions based here on the lake also, right down to and including the Vikings. Now there was massive Viking activity here on Lough Ree. Now when you think of the Vikings arriving first, they came, they plundered, they raided, they murdered, they stole. Yes, they did at the very beginning. Then they settled down and everything was grand. Yeah, one of the biggest Viking settlements in the whole country was only 10 minutes away from us here on Lough Ree, called Turkinov. Now they were farmers, they were traders, they traded with the locals, they intermarried with the locals. They traded hugely with the monks for this spirit. Simple reason being, the Vikings loved their alcohol, Viking drinking horns, etc. You can go continue through there, folks, and grand, work away. You're very welcome, we can go straight through there. How are you doing?
Welcome.
You're very welcome. Yeah, they traded massively with the Vikings, and as a result, the Vikings in turn, that said they loved their alcohol, Viking drinking horns, etc. The Vikings in turn had gold and silver. The monks wanted gold and silver in order to make their chalices and their crosses, all of which can be seen in the National Museum, having come from here on Lough Ree. So they traded together for centuries. The Vikings in turn brought the art of distillation with them back to the Scandinavian countries. And to this day, the national drink of all the Scandinavian countries is a drink called Aqua Vitae. Anybody heard of it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd run a lawnmower on it if you ran out of petrol, basically. Aqua Vitae, coming from Aqua Vitae, from the monks in Clonmacnoise, that's where it came from. Now they in turn, the Vikings in turn brought it further afield, and from Scandinavia, onto Iceland, onto Greenland, and onto Newfoundland, where they landed at a place called Landsaw Meadows, bringing the art of distillation with them from here on Lough Ree. It spread down to Canada and eventually made its way down to the States, known as different names along the way. White lightning, moonshine, for example. Now I know where you're from. What this documentary is actually going to do, it's going to begin here on Lough Ree with me, showing exactly how the monks originally distilled their whiskey. From there we're going to Scandinavia to show how Aqua Vitae is made to this day, and from there on to Newfoundland. But after that we're going to 4 areas: Carolina, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Franklin County in Virginia. And we're visiting 4 proper moonshine sites right across the whole spectrum to show that to this day, the actual method of distillation as used by the moonshiners is the exact form of distillation as was introduced and taught by the monks all those years ago. So that's actually what the documentary is doing. So, if I'm not arrested at some still site in the middle of Kentucky, there will be a documentary. And if there's no documentary, I'm possibly in jail anywhere between Kentucky and Carolina. Keep an eye, I may need bailing out somewhere along the way with this one. That's the documentary part of it. Getting back to the origin of whiskey then again, the very first written account of whiskey in the world comes from the Amateur History of Clonmacnoise also, where the monks speak about a local chieftain who on Christmas Day consumed way too much Aqua Vitae. He keeled over and died. So much for being Aqua Vitae, the water of life. It did not do what it said to do. It was more Aqua Mortis than Aqua Vitae. That's the first written account of whiskey in the world. The name whiskey comes from here on Lough Ree also, where after the Vikings you actually had the English armies of King Henry II and III based here on the lake. Simple reason being, they had a huge army here. They were dead centre Ireland, and they could mobilise and deploy that huge army up and down the length and breadth of the country by using the waterways of the Shannon system. That's why they were based here, right next door to the monks. The monks cashed in on this big time, traded hugely with these English armies. We even have a record of a ship belonging to King Henry II, leaving Lough Ree, and between both monasteries, that ship's entire cargo was whiskey only. They were not busy praying. They were the biggest bootleggers in the world. And if the truth was known, religion only came secondary to them. They were full-time distillers. And your whole idea of an Irish monk sitting in the corner with a Bible praying is now gone out the window. He was sitting in the corner all right, but he was distilling whiskey. That's what he was doing. Yeah, the name whiskey then comes from these English armies, where they loved their whiskey, but they had one problem. The monks up here spoke Irish, and they called it Ishkabaha. Now, try and pronounce that after having 9 or 10 of them. Swish kebab and whiskey and onto whiskey, and they coined the name whiskey, and it stuck to it. That is where the name whiskey comes from, right here, right beside us. We actually have how it began, when it began, who it began by, how it travelled right around the world, who took it there and when, all coming from here on Loughree. And all of this fully backed up with us by the National Museum of Ireland. It is there, it is history, and that's why this documentary is actually jumping onto this. Now I've forgotten what I was going to say. But yeah, that's the whole origin of whiskey. Now what we done next, we said, hold on a second, we have the origin of whiskey here, right on our doorstep. How do we take whiskey back to its origin? And we've done just that. We met with the master distillers from West Cork Distillery, 2 brothers, the O'Connell brothers, 2 geniuses at what they do with whiskey. Now neither of them will answer an email for about a month, but they're 2 geniuses at whiskey. We brought them up here, showed them all our history. They were absolutely amazed at the history we actually had here. And we then said to them, now how can you show us how to take whiskey back to its origin? They were looking at me as if I had 2 heads. We ended up going back to the island of Inishkiran, the original island belonged to the monks, to see what was available here on the island to the monks to flavour the whiskey with at the time. And they had to flavour it, tasted that bad. So they were able to tell us, yes, we can use that, you can't use that, but that's no good. That and that is going to work brilliantly when combined with that. And that is how we formulated or put our whiskey together. Now, as I say, we were in full production from day one. We had gone off mainstream whiskey altogether, and no guarantee whatsoever that this was going to come back in any way, shape or form right. And if it hadn't, I would not be in the country right now. I'd be hiding in the hills of Kentucky, somewhere out of the way where nobody could find me, everything that was involved with this one. So we then left it to mature. Now for whiskies to mature, a Scottish whiskey takes 3 years to mature. An Irish whiskey takes 3 years and 1 day to mature. Just to be a day older than the Scots. But to always ensure, Irish whiskey is always older than a Scottish whiskey. Even if it's only by 1 day, Irish whiskey is older than Scottish whiskey. And believe it or not, folks, that is old Irish law. What's more unbelievable, that law still exists to this day. So even now, for an Irish whiskey to mature, it still is 3 years and 1 day. Still to be 1 day older than the Scots. That's where we left our whiskey then to mature for 4.5 years as opposed to your normal. It came back the smoothest whiskey you will ever come across. It doesn't burn your mouth, catch you in the throat or afterburn. It is just smooth from start to finish the whole way through. We also have another whiskey, a 7-year-old single malt. If you're a single malt drinker, you will love it, and if you're not, you won't. The original one you're looking for. So that was what we've done with our whiskies, and how it came about and how we got there, and now everything is just starting to explode with us this year right now. Between the book, the documentary, we're launching in Canada, we're launching in Texas. It's only taken us 14 years to become an overnight success. Now, anybody here ever heard of poaching? Poaching, right, that's that conversation out the window. Poaching is actually old Irish illegal moonshine, basically. It is the same product as moonshine, distilled the same way, tastes the same way, is the same product, and totally illegal, exactly like moonshine. Now, how poaching came about, years ago we were governed by England, and they realised as a nation we drank a bit or we were fond of it. So they decided to tax all alcohol. Now years ago also, it was healthier to drink beer than it was to drink water. Beer was pasteurised, it contained calcium, nutrients, etc. The water, that stuff will kill you, don't drink that stuff. So you were allocated beer as part of your daily ration. Now these figures are real, they actually come from Dublin, has to do with rations, etc. See you folks, take care. Now, for example, a soldier was allocated up to 8 pints of beer a day. A hard-working person such as stonemason was allocated up to 14 pints of beer a day. That is why you will never see a straight wall anywhere else. So we did drink a bit, and yes, we were fond of it. So the English did tax alcohol and taxed it very heavily. This put a split right down the distillation community. Half went legal, took out their licenses, paid their taxes, paid their duties. But that made their alcohol extremely expensive. Overnight, they had accidentally created a huge boom in the poaching industry, as it was the only alcohol people could afford. Now the English were losing huge revenue to these punching makers, and they couldn't catch them. They were highly elusive. The only thing of value at a still sight was his copper pot still. And if he saw the sheriff or bailiff coming, I got it, he emptied it, buried it, hid it, disappeared himself. No hope of catching him now whatsoever. They brought out a number of laws to combat these punching makers. It now became, if a still site was found in an area, or a pot still found in an area, now the entire community from that area was fined and fined very heavily. They often used this as a method of taking land from the Irish as payment for these huge fines. That law drove the punching makers from the mainland here out onto Lough Ree and out onto the islands. And there's over 80 islands out there, and they were on each and every one of them. Now they had no hope of catching them at all. Once he saw the sheriff or bailiff getting into a boat on that shoreline, he was gone that way in his boat and his copper pot still under his arm. Not a hope of catching him. In their wisdom, they brought out more laws. These new laws now stated, if somebody found a pot still, handed it into the sheriff, they were given a huge reward for doing so. If somebody found a still site, brought the sheriff and bailiff out to it, they were given an equally huge reward for doing so. Now what the punching makers done next here was absolute genius. They got their old burnt out pot still. Now a pot still was only good for a number of runs, it was copper, it burnt itself out, useless, good for nothing, throw it away. They got the old burnt out pot still, brought it into the sheriff, found that. Sheriff gave him a huge reward for finding a pot still. Off he went, bought a brand new sheet of copper on the way home, picked a brand new pot still for himself, and had a ball of money left over in his pocket afterwards. Secondly, what they done, got their old burnt out pot still, planted it on land owned by the English gentry. Brought the sheriff and bailiff out, look, still site. By law, the sheriff had to hand him another pocket full of money. Off he went again, loaded. This went on for years and years, and they never caught what was going on whatsoever. Now the sheriff had a big problem. How would he find his own community when a still site was found on English land? Huge problem. They actually reckon the punching makers here on Lake Lough Ree had the sheriffs and bailiffs running around like headless chickens, handing out rewards left, right and centre. They reckon they made far more money just by handing in those burnt out pot stills than they could have ever made in an entire lifetime of actually selling punching. That's the punching makers here on Lough Ree. They were absolutely genius at what they done. Now a couple of phrases associated with alcohol and the monks and that here on the lakes. Anybody ever heard the term associated with alcohol, angel's share or spirits, wines and spirits, etc., associated with alcohol? This actually comes from the monks of Inishkiran. When they cast the whiskey, it was full. They put it aside, left it to mature. They didn't understand evaporation. And the longer they left it, the more evaporated out of it. And when they took the cask back, opened it, found X amount missing out of it, stopped fighting with one another and blaming one another for drinking it on the sly, they actually thought of the angels or the spirits that took that share, hence the term angel share or spirits associated with that. Another term, anybody heard blind drunk?
Yes. Yeah.
Last weekend, we will not go there again for a while. Actually comes from here on the lake, and it's well documented. There were many monks up here on the lake who were blind. Simple reason being, at the very beginning, they didn't understand distillation. They did not realise if you didn't throw away the very first run coming from your pot still, which was known as your heads, it was pure ethanol, and if you drank it, you went blind. So many of them went out, got pissed, woke up blind, great night out. So that's the term blind drunk, where it comes from. Another term, hungover, comes from here on Lough Ree also, where there's an area here called Wine Port, right next to where the monks were. This is where the ships would sail from both Portugal and Spain with their wine and with their port. They came up the River Shannon, out onto Lough Ree. They were now dead central Ireland, and they came from all around to actually purchase this wine and this port. Now these sailors would have been at sea for weeks and sometimes months, and when they got to port, believe me, they got blind drunk. But the first thing they'd done when they came and went into an inn or a tavern, they handed the innkeeper or the tavern owner a penny. And that was to guarantee their safety that night, that when they got blind drunk, they weren't thrown out on the street, robbed, mugged, or even killed. Now when they got blind drunk, each tavern or innkeeper had big sheds out the back with ropes hanging from one side to the other. And they dragged these sailors out, they hung them over these ropes, and left them there until the following morning until they sobered up and made their way back to the ship. Hence the term, how did you get on last night? Hungover. Now by the looks of things, you're well on your way to a good hangover or hungover tomorrow morning. And by the way, you want to start handing pennies in behind the bar now, and we have ropes for everybody out the back.